This guy's asking with his Gmail picture he zoomed in on as his profile picture. How many X's can PulseX do in the next peak bull?
Uh,
I mean, if Hex did 10,000 X, it's interesting because I think the liquidity is going to be different. So we'll need like more money than like Hex did. Hex was really low liquidity early on, you know? Like you
but no
barely
one
needed.
knows how much liquidity is going to start for a Pulse and PulseX.
Well, yeah, Pulse has like a lot of liquidity in my opinion because it has all
On
the liquidity
testnet,
that
yeah.
ETH has at launch with the amount of token supply.
Huh.
You know what I mean?
Interesting.
Because it's paired against every single thing, and then it does the it multiplies how much Ethereum's in there by how much more ratio wise
True.
Pulse is to the Ethereum, and then it's just paired with the added in PRC20s, so it should be
Right.
pretty thick, like liquidity.
Good point. That's a good
We're
point.
just wondering what the USD value is going to be.
Yeah.
So like once that gets in there, it's gonna be like, oh, who wants more dollars or PulseX or Pulse? We don't know if we want more. Well, the thing is, with with PulseChain, oh man, where
Talk to me. Talk to me.
PulseChain, PulseChain has so much liquidity, dude. I did videos on it, and it almost is like FUD. But I'm thinking that I wonder if Richard's thinking this stuff out too, and that's why it's delayed or whatever. But
Wow.
because there's so much liquidity out there that it it may be harder to move the price than people hope in the start. But I do see it launching similar to how Ethereum went for its ICO,
Yeah.
where it just went 10x straight up from the beginning at launch. People traded their Bitcoin for it, and it never went below what they sacrificed. It dropped like 80 some percent from the 10x, and then it made new all-time highs like a 50x from that bottom. And I think it's the same thing with PulseChain and similarly PulseX. I think PulseX is going to be way less liquid because the only liquidity that's going to be out there is what users who own PulseX from the sacrifice phase decide to put up,
Interesting.
as opposed to Pulse, which has like all of this amount that's just provided by the AMM bot that mints extra that isn't owned by anyone. It's owned by an address that you can't expect anything from. But if they put a bunch of liquidity out there, like we're not earning those fees, that thing is, and it seems like there's supposed to be a lot. You'd have to watch my other video, I guess. I don't know the exact numbers right now because it was a while
You got
ago.
me thinking. Okay. I do see what you're talking about with PulseX specifically. How make sure my PulseX shield is not. So since it's a new coin, right? The only people who are getting PulseX are the people who sacrifice for PulseX. What you're saying is for Pulse, you're getting the sacrificers as well as all of the Ethereum being turned into Pulse.
That's right. That's the AMM bot
right?
doing that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, like 1-to-1 Ethereum turns into Pulse on the PulseChain side, and then you have the AMM bot come in, mint a bunch of Pulse,
Yeah, mints like
buy up
multiple percents of the total supply,
total
which
supply.
when you know that the user-owned supply is only 10% of the total supply, you're like, okay, 2% of 10
Like
of
150
like that means it's
trillion,
20% of the supply in liquidity pools
Yeah.
already, and it's not like users put it there. So there's like
But
hundreds of millions of dollars of
but it's I think it's not necessarily. Hold on. Here. This is what's fucking
I
with
would
my brain
love
right
for
now.
this to be dispelled. I've never
Hear me out.
talked about it
So
that much.
you have all these pools of like, let's say Hex Ethereum. Let's say the Hex Ethereum liquidity pool, right? Gets forked over. It becomes a Hex Pulse liquidity pool. A bunch of Pulse is minted. The Hex is bought up. So there's less Hex in there and a ton of Pulse, right? Like there's less of the PRC20s because they're all bought up, and there's going to be more Pulse in the liquidity pools because that was what the AMM bot minted. buy up.
In Uniswap and SushiSwap, but in PulseX, it's going to have all those PRC20s that it, bought up, and then it's going
Yeah.
to mint new Pulse, multiple percents of the supply, total supply, so several trillion out of the 130 trillion or so.
For liquidity?
Yeah.
I thought that was just to buy up the coins.
But it has to pair it with the equal amount of Pulse. So you end up putting all that bot stuff with the minted stuff over there, and it mints even more. But to pair them together equally to keep the ratio the same. And so there's like trillions of Pulse. But we talked. Well, we might just end up releasing less. So like instead of deploying all of it, maybe less. So it's really up to how they decide to do it. So it's not set in stone yet. So, technically nothing's set in stone for PulseChain, I guess. So they might do something different. But anyway, PulseX has way less liquidity, just right off the bat, because it has none.
The PRC20s will be harvested. I still want to stick on this thought. I'm deep, man. You got me in this. I'm not getting out of this rabbit hole yet.
Are we gonna have to pull up my video? Because I totally
hear me out. So, so it'll buy up all the PRC20s, right? We don't necessarily know how much liquidity it's gonna. We know it's gonna do the same ratios, right? We want to keep the ratios the same, but ratios can be, 1/1 is the same ratio as 10,000 over 10,000. The ratios don't necessarily speak to the thickness of the liquidity, do they?
So,
yeah, that's tricky.
So basically, it is my understanding that the bot comes in early or whatever, or before it's live for everyone else, and goes into Uniswap, SushiSwap, and all the liquidity there, it'll mint some Pulse,
right,
to purchase up like 99% of the PRC20s.
Mm-hmm.
And so it fills it, and it actually doesn't take much because of the way, how AMMs work, where it only cares about the units, and it doesn't care about like the value of the actual tokens. It only cares about the ratio. And so you really only have to put in like, I don't know, a couple, maybe 100,000 Pulse or something to get 99% of the PRC20. And so you're like, oh, only 100,000 Pulse. That was like $100 got you a million Pulse. So you're like, oh, that's like nothing. But what it does is to keep that ratio it was at with the amount of, because what it bought that up out of Uniswap, right? And with a little bit of Pulse that it minted, and then to keep that ratio of how there's so much Pulse in there and a little bit of PRC20, because it has to leave some in the Uniswap. It takes that same ratio where there's 100,000 Pulse over here, and there's like 1 hex or something. Then when it gets to PulseX, it keeps that same ratio, but it has all of the PRC20. And so you have to multiply by like 1,000 how much Pulse there is, because the ratio on Uniswap is 100,000 to 1 hex, and now it's, and this is just made up numbers. I'm just trying to use high numbers because it's high Pulse versus the PRC20. And so it has to do it again over in the PulseX and mint 1,000 times the amount it did before over there in Uniswap to put enough Pulse to equal the amount of PRC20 that it has, because it bought it up. I don't know if that explained it well, but
no, I see what you're saying. I just personally didn't know that there were going to be like, I didn't know, and I still don't know actually if the case of what you're saying is actually accurate. But you might be right actually about the minting more for the liquidity. Like I was aware it's going to mint Pulse 5 the PRC20s. I wasn't aware it was going to like mint even more extra Pulse, keep that ratio, and then stick them in. It's the whole sticking the PRC20s into PulseX that I never really thought about, like the mechanics behind that. So you're actually making me think about that right now.
Yeah, the math works like this. So like if you have to get 1,000,000x, you just have to do 1,000 times 1,000.
Well, yeah.
And the way you get that is if you just look at like the hex ETH pair, you can pretty much guess what the hex Pulse pair on PulseChain is going to be by just 1,000 timesing the amount of ETH in there. And then that
Yes.
buys up 99% of the pool because you 1,000 times it. So it's like going to buy 99.9% of the PRC20. And then there's that ratio in there. Whatever that ratio is, you have to multiply that again by another 1,000 for the pulse chain whenever it deploys it into PulseX to pair it with all the PRC20 that it has, because it has 1,000 times more PRC20 than that other location. So you have to equal that out by minting more pulse to pair up. So it really is a lot of liquidity, and it's not by the community. So
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it that way. In that case, yeah, PulseX might.
I bet my other video I do I think I did it in Excel and just like showed how to do it. I'll probably like post it or something again.
I mean,
Maybe
yeah, you did the math right here on stream. It's like the hex ETH pair. I'm gonna round up. There's like 30 million hex and like 1,000 ETH.
Mm-hmm.
So after the fork, you're gonna have 30 million hex and 1,000 pulse. That doesn't make sense, right? Because there's a million X more pulse than ETH in terms of supply. So you're like, all right, so I have 30 million hex, 1,000 pulse. We need 1,000x the pulse side, and divide the other, which naturally divides the other side by 1,000 the way AMMs work. So instead of having 30 million hex, now you have 30,000 hex, and instead of having 1,000 ETH, now you have a million pulse. You have 30,000 hex backed by a million pulse. Whatever ratio that is
pulse by
like
another
33 pulse per hex. There you go. And then you bought up how many like oh my god, like almost all of the hex, like almost 30 million. And if you need to have that ratio of 30 million, like 33, then you get you have to print a billion pulse, basically.
That's right.
Yeah, quick math.
And that's just hex who has very low liquidity.
Yeah.
So if you look at the other ones, it all kind of adds up. I mean, my math worked out to be like, because Richard based it off of, he thought it would have to mint 2.5% or something.
Yeah.
But whenever I did my because I think he did that based on like wrapped Ethereum, and he figured that was in DeFi, so like that's how much is in the pools. But actually, majority of wrapped Ethereum is actually in like compound Aave stuff that's like requires oracles or something. So like we can't even do much with that. And the rest of it, there's only around like 1% of the Ethereum supply in liquidity pools that their bot can probably get to buy up all the majority of the PRC20s. And so I think it's only going to be a 1% of the supply will be in the pools at the start, is my guess. I wish Richard would talk on it. I'd probably ask him about it. But yeah, that's more than PulseX will have in liquidity pools, because we start with 0 in liquidity pools. You get to decide how much PulseX you will sell, and I will not be selling any for a long time. I'll be buying